Hi guys, back with another video. Today I want to talk about faith, and more precisely, loss of religious faith and the relationship between the believing person and the non-believing person, and more specifically, the relationship between the life of someone when they believed versus the life of the person who ceases to believe. I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I've been thinking about a passage from William James, his famous book, Varieties of Religious Experience. Now, the book's more than 100 years old now, but it's still definitely worth reading. There's been a lot of studies of religion and religious faith and religious experience since then, but this book really is a benchmark, and definitely needs to be, well, could definitely be considered a good place to start in terms of the philosophical study of religious faith. As you know, or suspect, I've been studying religion for years. I have a PhD and master's in theology. And obviously I've read a lot of literature about belief by believers and by people analyzing religious belief. Now, I'm drawn today to this passage from William James where he talks about a man who lost his fortune and basically reaches a crisis point in his life where he contemplates killing himself, and then in the last moment kind of thing, he decides to put every ounce of his strength into reamassing his fortune, and so in the end he dies an inveterate miser worth £60,000. £60,000 in those days would be several $1 million today. So James uses this passage as a way to show that people can have different kinds of conversions, I suppose, and this was a conversion to avarice. But what it does show is, of course, that people can put their whole selves into something other than God. Now, I was thinking about this passage, and I definitely misremembered it. I was thinking of this passage as an example of someone converting from belief in God to belief in money, I suppose, for lack of a better word. But that's not what the expression shows. But I was thinking about that. Someone who can go in the opposite direction, who can convert from love of God to love of money, I suppose, from the higher goods to the lower goods. And it's kind of a deconversion or perversion, in Augustine's sense, that Augustine said that we have to love more of the higher things. So that was how he understood our relationship to the world, is that love of material goods should be the lowest, should not be our priority, but should be our lowest concern, whereas love of neighbor should be higher than that, and love of self should be higher than that, and then ultimately love of God should be the highest, should be our highest priority. What's it like when that's reversed? It's interesting. In several cases we see, for instance, this was a priority, or not a priority, but a definite interest for someone like Dostoevsky, who looked at the growing atheism and anarchism of his times and thought several times about loss of faith. And this is something that was really well attended to in the Brothers Karamazov, where faith is contemplated as something that holds you back, and that once you're freed from it, you can really live. And Dostoevsky contemplates, well, how far can that go? And this was one of the tenets of the, I suppose, atheistic movement of the time, in a leading philosopher of this area, Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach wrote a few very important works. One of them is known as The Essence of Christianity, and he wrote lectures on religion. Now his view could very easily be summed up in the following lecture, and I'm going to quote a bit of it, and I'll put it on the video here too. This is Feuerbach's thesis in a nutshell. He says, God is nothing other than the abstracted, phantasmagoric essence of man and nature, hypostasized by the imagination. Hence, theism sacrifices the real life and nature of things and of men to a being who is a mere product of thought and imagination. Thus, atheism is positive and affirmative. It gives back to nature and mankind the dignity of which theism has despoiled them. It restores life to nature and mankind, which theism has drained out of their best powers. God, as we have seen, is jealous of nature and man. He wants man to honor, love, and serve him alone. He wants everything else to be nothing, and himself alone to be something. In other words, theism is jealous of man and the world, and begrudges them any good. Envy, ill will, and jealousy are destructive, negative passions. Atheism, on the other hand, is liberal, open-handed, open-minded. An atheist acknowledges every being's will and talent. His heart delights in the beauty of nature and the virtue of man. Joy and love do not destroy, they are life-giving, affirmative. So that's a very powerful passage, and it's been very influential. Atheists don't see themselves as negators, they see themselves as affirmers. Now, in 1851, when those lectures were first published, those are credible ideas. They're ideas that were nascent, of course, in the French Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment, where religion was depicted as the only thing that's holding man back from happiness. But after the revolutions, well, in France and in Russia and in China and in Korea, it's possible to hold the exact opposite interpretation. It seems like that paragraph should be completely rewritten with the replace all between atheism and religion and atheism. But still the argument is being made. Now, strictly speaking, philosophically speaking, the truth of religion is neither proved nor disproved by its positive consequences in the world. But the fact is, people can point to, for instance, on the one hand, the fact that the biggest runner of hospitals, of schools, of outreach, for instance, in Africa, is the Catholic Church. And after that, other churches. But then on the other hand, people can point to and say, well, religion has held man back for 1,000 years from the fall of the Roman Empire to the scientific revolution. Now, of course, that's a stupid supposition, but it's one that's been entertained by notable figures like Dawkins and so on. But it's another utterly ridiculous supposition. I'm not saying that religion can't hold back scientific progress. It does, and it can. It can and it does. But as a scholar of religion, it's necessary to point out that different religions have different attitudes towards scientific progress. The fact of the matter is, the invasions that led to the destruction of the Roman Empire were devastating, followed by the Viking invasions. Yeah, it was not a good environment, politically speaking, for scientific progress. I mean, think even what ravages the coronavirus has done on our economy and on education, for instance. Education has been stifled these last 2 years from a simple thing not much stronger than a common cold. So magnify that 1,000 times, and then you have the invasions of the Huns, the Goths, the Vandals, the Magyars, the Vikings, the Mongols. So the fact is, there are aspects of religion and even aspects of Catholicism that are friendly to advance in science. You could look at someone like St. Thomas Aquinas and the importance he placed on natural reason, basing his own theology on the philosophy of Aristotle, man as a rational animal. Now it's obvious when you take for instance the fundamentalism, and I've encountered a lot of it in my life, and it's been surprising. I grew up in the family of a scientist, a biologist, and it was always surprising to me that that people could think of religion and science as opposed to each other. But of course, over the years, I've encountered many who think that, for instance, evolution and the doctrine of creation are opposed. It never occurred to me that they could be, but many people fundamentally believe that. But on the other hand, do atheistical values solve the problem? Well, just recently, I say not just recently, but every time there's a scientific, or I should say, there's an advance in space science, and there's a lot of them now, you hear a lot of people, and they're social justice warriors, people inspired by socialism and Marxism. They say, well, they echo the words of Judas, couldn't this money have been spent to feed the poor? So it's not just religion that offers opposition to scientific progress, and scientific progress should be opposed, in my opinion, sometimes. And we could take, for instance, eugenics, the immoral investigations, torture, these scientific investigations. Because they're scientific does not mean that they should be done at all cost. And this is another lesson I think that some people are drawing from the coronavirus pandemic. The pandemic, it appears, was caused by gain-of-function research in a laboratory, promoted both by the Chinese and apparently the American government. And the destruction caused by that little research certainly should serve as a warning that gain of knowledge at any cost is not a good thing, should not be encouraged. I think nowadays, and many science fiction writers have written about this, and I think more and more are sounding the alarm that scientific progress has consequences. It doesn't just better us, it changes us. I make the point in my zombie novel that, for instance, I make the observation that the invention of the automobile meant that my main character couldn't walk all day. He lost a capability that his ancestors had, that his ancestors possessed and could easily execute. Could I walk all day? I'd be exhausted by the end of it, and I'd need lots of breaks, that's for sure. So it's not just, scientific progress doesn't just bring progress, it brings change. And this is one of the lasting lessons of Wells' Time Machine as well. When the main character goes, whatever it is, 800,000 years into the future, he doesn't see human beings improved, he sees human beings changed. So in other words, Feuerbach's old observation that religion is opposed, it denatures nature, it weakens nature, and it weakens man because it takes away the power and the virtue from man and nature and gives it to God. As with most things, there's a grain of truth in that. And the old observation is that the doctrine of grace weakens our doctrine of free will. So if we need grace to do a thing, to be good, then we automatically believe that we don't have the power of our own accord, of our own free will. And then we can start, arriving at absurd notions like that exemplified in the novel Confessions of a Justified Sinner, where you can simply say, well, God didn't give me the virtue or the grace to not do evil. Okay? No true exponent of the doctrine of grace would accept such a facile surmise, but nevertheless, it's a psychological influence, isn't it? And people talk about the devil made me do it kind of thing. Now that's an exaggeration, but there is a grain of truth in it, isn't there? And I found that a lot in my dealings with believing people, with the church. There is a tendency to want to disguise one's own will with the will of God, to excuse one's own behavior, one's own choices, as the will of God. But these factors are not absolute. There are no absolutely religious people or absolutely scientific people. There are no people who have absolutely worked out the domains of religion on the one hand and of rationality or science on the other hand. Nobody's objective and nobody's purely religious. Everything is important. All these factors are important to think about and to look at. But it's also important not to exaggerate. So in other words, gain of faith doesn't turn one into a saint, and loss of faith doesn't turn one into a Superman, as Nietzsche sort of famously conjectured. Now Nietzsche was smart enough to know that there were no absolutes here either, and that it was a process, a difficult process, a striving, that even atheistic perfection was a rare accomplishment in that sense. That's what we see in his great work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It is a very difficult journey to make the man, in that sense, fully alive. And it occurs to me, to contrast Tertullian's doctrine that the glory of God is man fully alive with Nietzsche's doctrine of the Superman. I mean, neither one is ultimately all that convincing, but arguments can be made for both of them. I guess, in a way, isn't a middle doctrine the doctrine of, isn't a sort of middle ground the doctrine of man's search for meaning, where it is that for any man who has a why, he can do anything, or he can accomplish, or he can endure anything, as long as he has a why. If man has a reason to believe, to endure, then he can accomplish great things and he can endure great suffering. So the conjecture here is that it doesn't matter what you believe in as long as you fully believe in it. Now that's not ultimately satisfying either, because what one believes in shapes what one does. So it's not just about fully engaging your will, because ideas have consequences. In my experience, gain of belief can make a person better, and loss of belief we generally think would make one worse. We think of Voltaire's old idea that it's necessary for one's servants to believe in God so they don't rise up and kill you and steal from you and all that. But why is it then that Ivan Karamazov can't do what he wants to do? When he loses belief in God, he can't kill his father. It's Dmitri, who doesn't have these strong ideas and ideals, who ends up being the one to kill his father. And in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, in a way, he parallels Ivan Karamazov, and he can't do it either. I mean, he kills the old lady, but he can't live with himself afterwards. And I think the lasting lesson from Dostoevsky is that ideas are one thing, and they're important, but they don't cure our psychological condition. They don't rule our psychological condition. When we think of something like murder, these aren't just taboos artificially constructed through culture, but there's something deeply biological about them. Human beings have the ability to kill and even to commit homicide, kill their own kind, but it's not irrespective of the conditions at hand. We are a social being, we are a herd animal, and we don't turn on our own herd for no reason at all, generally speaking. There are psychopathic and biological sicknesses and deviations that explain these huge departures, but in the normal run of things, even a soldier in war is often harmed by indiscriminate killing that he has to take part in when he knows that's his job, that's what his society expects of him. Of course, there's a big difference between when your society thanks you for your work, like in World War I and World War II, versus when your society doesn't, or doesn't completely, as in, for instance, soldiers returning from the Vietnam War. The role of the superego in that case is clearly powerful, but it's not the only factor that needs to be considered. Now, whether religion makes you better or worse is obviously at the heart of much of our cultural lore. And despite people like Stephen King thinking that religion is only a force for evil, it's simply not true. And it's interesting how I think many of the current problems with our society today are precisely the result of a loss of Christianity, of Christian faith. You can see its destruction and its evil consequences in the black community, for instance. Sometimes it's easier to note things when a culture is not your own than it is to see them in your own culture. But the change in the black culture since the 50s and 60s has been massive, and I think it coincides and corresponds with a loss of faith in that community, or a decentralization of faith in that community. And the observations I make about the black community, I can make very easily about the white community as well. I suppose if there is such a thing as a white community, I don't think there is. But the movement away from the civic virtues seems to correspond and be caused by the movement away from Christian virtues and belief. And you can say, well, the Romans had strong civic virtues despite the fact that they weren't Christian, and the observation was made by critics of Christianity, and this was the burden that St. Augustine had to take upon himself when he wrote The City of God, his longest work. Did the fact that the Romans stopped worshipping the ancient pantheon, did this produce the fall of the Roman Empire? Now, in Augustine's time, there was no fall of the Roman Empire, but there was the sack of Rome by the Goths, and the weakening of the Roman Empire was obvious to everyone. And initially, the pagan Romans blamed the conversion of the empire to Christianity. Now again, there's some truth to that. Christianity has a pacific element in it, and Christianity is a brotherhood religion. It's not a tribal religion. It was an international religion in that case. The God of Jesus didn't make distinctions between types of people, and that's a doctrine that's very, very plain in, for instance, the book of Acts. It's a central point as the apostles are trying to come to grips with the fact that their religion is no longer Jewish, but it's for lack of a better word, international. Yeah, that weakens the Roman Empire. If the Roman Empire is based upon the fact that Roman ways and Roman people are the best people in ways, then it has to weaken. And we see this in the United States today, for instance, with the movement away from American values, democratic values, the American dream. It's a weakening of the American empire because, as for instance, the internationalism of socialism means that the nationalism which makes the United States powerful diminishes its strength. So the observation that religion strengthens and weakens civic virtue, and not just, say, philanthropy, is again something that should be considered. And it's funny, you know, when you think about the so-called international, the effects of the international philosophy of Marxism, once it's put in place in a nation, it has to lose its international character. Originally, the meetings of Marxists in Europe were called the internationals. When communism took over in Russia, and Russia became the center of communist belief, that international character had to change. And so even in China, for instance, there's a constant interplay between the global mission of Marxism and the unique Chinese-ness of Maoism, of Maoist Marxism. So with all these things, and you'll find it as well with the political parties in different countries, there's certain aspects of the values of their constituencies that value international values, globalism, the universal brotherhood of man, but you're not going to get very far in elections in any one country if you don't appeal to people's patriotism, their chauvinism, the fact that they are the country you want to represent is a special country. People can say that the decline now of the European Union is being caused by that lack, that what do I believe in? You know, what do people in the European Union believe in? It's hard to say. Do they believe in their own nation? Do they believe in Europe? Do they believe in globalism? Do they believe in Western values? Do they believe in Marxist values? These are all different and competing and confusing allegiances and doctrines. So anyway, in the end, there's no clear answers, there's no clear solutions, there's no clear remedies for all the evils of the modern world, whether we're talking about the evils of nationalism or the virtues of nationalism. Like anything, too much of a medicine becomes a poison. So if we return to the original problem, God and the 60,000 pounds, what's the relationship between the two? And would one be comfortable with a person who says, my belief in God means that I should amass a fortune for whatever reason? I mean, even the best of reasons, so that someday I can give it away to whatever, the poor, is such a deontology, such a narrow, strict equation. Does that make you comfortable? A life driven in that way by, say, In this case, the religious miser, or the miser with a point, the miser with a goal. Does that make you comfortable? What are religion's consequences for poetry and art? What are religion's consequences for politics, for civic mindedness? I talk about religion in the abstract, but obviously I generally mean Christianity. I think that Islam and Christianity have different values, strongly different values that lead to very different kinds of politics, and they can't be summarily dismissed or even summarily equated. But anyway, this is just the beginning of a discussion. What is the relationship between belief and 60,000 pounds? Anyway, thanks for listening, and hopefully we'll be able to build on this in the future. Thanks, guys.